Hello and welcome to this week's edition of We the People, the only show that takes a look at local, state, and national politics as it pertains to East Alabama, particularly the Anniston and Oxford area. My name is Corey A. Bradford. Thank you for joining us. Now, this past weekend in Anniston, Alabama, there was a very special event called AniCon. If any of you are familiar with Comic-Con, it's very similar to that. People dress up, do cosplay, things like that. There were a lot of millennials there, people in my particular age group, 20-somethings and young teens, and we actually got to talk to some of them about the political issues that are most important to them. And so we're going to see those interviews later today. Also, we're going to introduce a new segment this week called The Historical Perspective, where we'll take a look at something that happened a long time ago in history and related to how things are going today. But first things first, I want to take a look at some of the very interesting things going on at the Alabama State Legislature. First thing first, it's time for the state of our state. All right, so let's talk about state news. Let's talk about what's going on in the Alabama State House. Now, this particular week, there are two very fascinating stories coming out of the Alabama State House, both of which have a huge impact on the citizens of this state. And it's very important that we talk about both of them. The first story is about an Alabama state senator by the name of Tripp Pittman, who is proposing an amendment to the Alabama state constitution, the 1901 Constitution, which is basically the law of the land here in Alabama. Tripp Pittman is proposing an amendment to this constitution that would abolish the Alabama State Senate, basically getting rid of all Alabama state senators. Now, to put this in a little bit of perspective, basically, when all the states were forming in the beginning of the United States of America, all of them had to set up their own state government. And pretty much every single one of them patterned that state government after the federal government. They established what we call a bicameral house, in which you have an upper house and a lower house in your government. The upper house is usually the Senate. The lower house is usually the representatives. And now every single state in America has this, with the exception of Nebraska. They're the only state in America right now that has a unicameral system in which they only have one house. And that is what Tripp Pittman is proposing for Alabama. He is proposing that we get rid of the Alabama State Senate. That would also get rid of the job of lieutenant governor. Currently, our lieutenant governor is Kay Ivey. She presides over the state Senate, and her job would also be abolished by this amendment. And basically, the end goal here is to save money. Alabama is in extreme amount of debt right now. And this is basically getting rid of all of those state jobs, those high-end state jobs in the government would allow for more money for the, the state budget and everything. Is this a good idea? It's really hard to say. I mean, this would be a huge, drastic change to the way the Alabama state government is set up. It would get rid of all state senators. Now, having less politicians might not be a bad thing, but at the same time, it's a very drastic change that might be a little too drastic for the state of Alabama. But then again, like you said, no state senators, less politicians, maybe more would get done in Montgomery if you had less people in their hands in it. I mean, it's an interesting idea. It would be very unique for Alabama to take on that kind of system. But like I said, right now, it's just a proposal. It hasn't actually gone through or anything, but it's something to think about, that we may not, in the next few years, have state senators in Alabama. We may just have representatives. It's a very interesting concept. The other big thing going on in Alabama state news is another proposed change to the Alabama voting laws. Now, we talked about on our first episode about how in the state of Alabama, you have to have a driver's license or a state-issued voter ID to vote. Well, that's when you actually go to the polls and you actually, go to the actual voting polls on Tuesday and then, vote. You have to show those IDs. Well, now, Alabama Secretary of State John Merrill is proposing another change to the voting laws. Now, when you register to vote, when you actually send your voter registration in or you go to the courthouse to register to vote, he's proposing a change that makes it where you now have to prove you are a United States citizen in order to vote. How do you prove it? Well, you have to show them a birth certificate or a passport that proves you're a United States citizen. Now, driver's license wasn't enough. That was already kind of a thing because some people don't drive and everything like that. But now they're saying, and hasn't been implemented yet, but now they're saying if this change goes through, you would have to present your birth certificate or passport in order to register to vote in Alabama. Now, the problem with that is if you're 45, 50 years old, maybe even 60 or 70 years old, it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to have kept up with your birth certificate that entire time. I mean, I'm in my mid 20s and it would probably take me a little bit to find my birth certificate. Imagine someone much older, things get lost over time. Providing a birth certificate is a requirement to vote is pretty extreme. It's pretty extreme. Now, this is obviously aimed at illegal immigration. It's obviously aimed at people who may not have been born in this country who are trying to vote in this country. That's obviously what this is aimed at. But there are going to be a lot of people who aren't illegal immigrants, people who are white, black, Mexican, and otherwise, who aren't going to have access to the birth certificate. They're not going to have lost it. Obviously, you can get birth certificates reissued by the state, but that's a very, very long and drawn out process, and it's going to deter a lot of people from voting. Now, when it came to the driver's license thing, I didn't think that was a big deal, although it's a bit of an issue for some people. I think that that's a reasonable demand for Alabama to say, hey, you need a license to vote. But to say you need a birth certificate or a passport, both of which are just very impractical documents for most people to obtain, I think that's a little extreme. This is a bill that hasn't yet been passed. There's a lot of opposition to it. There's a lot of support for it. But I think personally speaking, I think that's a little extreme. And the question I have for you all out there is, do you all think that you would be able to get your birth certificate? Do you think that it would be very easy for you to present that to register to vote? And do you think that that would be, an easy thing to do, basically? Because if not, it's just going to make it harder to vote, and it's just going to corrupt the voting system here in Alabama, making it where only a few people can be in power, people who have, the right things in place to get themselves in power, and it's going to deter people from voting, not only in state elections, but in national elections as well. So those are two of the big stories that are going on here in Alabama. When we come back, we're going to introduce a new segment called The Historical Perspective.